Running a business in Philadelphia takes a lot. It takes strong relationships, unique insight, and inspired leadership. It takes staying in the know and making the most of every opportunity. Everything it takes is everything you'll find at CCPA. A resource for business support, a chance to hear from experts in their field, and get up close and personal with city leaders. An insider's guide to what's happening and what's next in Philadelphia. With CCPA, business is personal.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to have everyone with us today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Suzette Munley, the president of CCPA. Hope everyone's having a nice start to fall and that everyone is doing well. So to tell you a little bit about us, CCPA is an intimate and diverse group of business owners, executives, and managers looking to build relationships and offer each other meaningful resources. We take pride in bringing you unparalleled access to speakers, decision makers, and leaders who are shaping Center City. We keep our members and guests informed about business challenges and opportunities in Philadelphia. So let's take a minute and touch on the benefits of becoming a member, a sponsor, or collaborating with CCPA. We think it's easiest to remember as being Center City smart. We have signature events where you get the inside scoop on development, sustainability, exceptional women leaders, and the city's movers and shakers. There are marketing opportunities available only to members and sponsors, enabling you to reach thousands of businesses and consumers. You have access to our speakers and panelists in a way few organizations can deliver. The up-close, intimate, and personal experience of a CCPA event is like no other. You can reimagine employee benefits available to members through Penworth Financial Services, and you can take the lead with opportunities to build your network, grow your business, and be a CCPA ambassador. So if you'd like to join today, there is a link posted in the chat. And to mark your calendars for our upcoming events, they are posted now on your screen. So please take note of those. A special call out to our next lunch with the city leaders with Philadelphia's Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw on October 28th. And our next two events are in person, and we're thrilled to be able to say that. Meet the Developers and Women Changing the City. So for today's event, we do encourage you to use the chat to ask questions or comment and to connect with each other. And you can also find a link to today's program there. I'd like to acknowledge our sustaining sponsor and our preferred benefits provider, Michael Craig of Penworth Financial Services. And we are pleased to collaborate with and welcome members of the Energy Co-op. And now I'd like to welcome CCPA Vice President and the creator of this series, David Lane, to say a few words and to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Suzette. Good morning, everyone. As Suzette said, I'm David Lane, co-founder of Led Lane. We are an integrated marketing communications agency in Center City, Philadelphia. Our services include branding, creative development, public relations, linear, offline media, web services, and so forth and so on. It's a great variety of clients. CCPA understands that a healthy city with clean air to breathe, fresh water to drink, parks and open spaces for recreation are the building blocks for strong economic activity. A city where people want to work, live, raise families, and enjoy life in a healthy urban environment. And that is what we want for our city and why we created this series. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Lori Brennan, Keith Fisher, and Julie Ulrich. And let's first talk about Lori. She has served as executive director of the Pennsylvania and Delaware chapter of the Nature Conservancy since March of 2020. Her responsibilities include implementing the Nature Conservancy's ambitious conservation agenda that benefits both people and nature. She leads a team of more than 40 dedicated scientists, fundraisers, marketing, finance, and conservation and operations staff. She works with other state chapters and external partners across the region to making the world a better place by being part of the solution to fight climate change and positively impact the planet for future generations. And Lori will be joined by Keith Fisher. He's Director of Conservation Programs for the Pennsylvania and Delaware chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And also Julie Ulrich serves as Director of Urban Conservation for the Nature Conservancy's Pennsylvania Delaware chapter. Their full biographies are in the program. We posted in the chat, so please join me in a warm welcome to Lori, Keith, and Julie. Welcome, and turn it over to you, Lori.
Great. Thank you so much, David. I think Ben's going to pull up our presentation here, but while we do, I just want to say good morning, everybody, and I want to thank Ben, Suzette, and the team at CCPA for inviting all of us and for you to take the time out of, I know, what are very busy schedules to learn about our work. Also, a special thank to Rick Spiesman, who's one of our trustees joining us on this call and is actually chair of our urban committee. I'm going to start our presentation giving you a little background about the Nature Conservancy. Next slide, Ben. So the Nature Conservancy is a global environmental nonprofit that works to create a world where people and nature can thrive. We were founded in 1951 and have grown to become one of the world's most effective and wide-reaching environmental organizations. Next slide. Just as critical to the Conservancy's success as our mission and vision are our unique values. These are the distinguishing attributes that characterize how we conduct ourselves in our drive for tangible and lasting results. We know that enduring conservation success depends on the active involvement of people and partners whose lives and livelihoods are linked to the natural systems we seek to conserve. We respect the needs, values, and traditions of local communities and cultures, and we forge relationships based on mutual benefit and trust. We recognize that conservation is best advanced by the leadership and contributions of people from diverse backgrounds, experiences, and identities. Our strength and vitality lie in being one organization working together locally and across borders to achieve our global mission. And we use the best available science, a creative spirit, and a non-confrontational approach to craft innovative solutions to complex conservation problems at scales that matter in ways that will endure. Next slide. Our programs are all designed to address the planet's biggest challenges, and we're tackling some of the toughest ones facing people and nature. Today, we face a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis, and addressing both of these are critical to the Conservancy achieving our mission. The Nature Conservancy focuses on the priorities that science shows us are most urgent and where innovation and expertise can have the most significant impact. Next slide. Oh, I think we go back. I'm sorry. I think go back one more. Yep, sorry. First and foremost, we lead with our values, honoring Indigenous and local people's voices, choices, and actions. You'll hear more about how this work directly touches down in Philadelphia later from my colleague, Julie. We ground our strategies in the places identified by our science, maximizing our ability to affect change for nature and the people who rely on it. We strive for solutions that benefit biodiversity, sequester carbon, and reduce the risk to people most vulnerable from the harm of climate change. In a nonpartisan way, the Nature Conservancy leverages policy, partnerships, and finance mechanisms to advance conservation far beyond any one place. Next slide. I think you want to go to the map, Ben. Thank you. The Nature Conservancy works on the ground and in the water in the world's largest cities and smallest villages, in government centers and classrooms. Our scientists, policy experts, and local leaders collaborate to tackle climate change, protect lands and waters, provide food and water sustainably, build healthy cities, and connect people and nature so that we can all thrive together, no matter where we call home. Thanks to more than 1 million members and the dedicated efforts of our diverse staff and more than 400 scientists, we impact conservation in 79 countries and territories across 6 continents. Next slide. You'll hear later from my colleagues about TNC's ambitious 2030 goals. I'll spend a minute here talking about how we're set up to achieve our ambitious outcomes in Pennsylvania and Delaware. In early 2020, the Nature Conservancy's Pennsylvania and Delaware programs merged to create one unified chapter tackling some of the most pressing issues in our state. We have more than 40 staff, including offices in Conshohocken, Wilmington, Harrisburg, and the Pocono Mountains. And I know we're all very eager to get back to working in those offices instead of from our homes. We have more than 34,000 members, 400 volunteers, and 17 board members who dedicate their time and resources to supporting our work, and we couldn't do it without them. Using a variety of techniques, we effectively manage and leverage our network of preserves for maximum impact in both Pennsylvania and Delaware. And we've protected more than 132,000 acres with 32 preserves, 15 of which are accessible to the public. I'd now like to turn things over to my colleague, Keith Fisher, who will talk in more detail about the large-scale conservation programs that are critical to the health and well-being of both people and nature in our 2 states. Keith?
Thank you, Lori, and good morning, everyone. Just to briefly introduce myself, I'm Director of Conservation Programs. And in that role, I oversee kind of the breadth of our conservation work across the geography, including its linkages with our kind of regional and our global programs. And in this segment, I'm going to provide kind of a brief overview of our conservation work in Pennsylvania and Delaware, touching on everything the Nature Conservancy is working in here. And Julie's going to provide a more in-depth interview of our urban program work later. Next slide. So over the past several years, the Nature Conservancy has been working to define and refine our global conservation priorities. These represent a set of conservation goals we are working to achieve by 2030. And these goals, as Lori said, are designed to address our planet's biggest challenges. They focus on priorities our science shows are the most urgent and places where our innovation and expertise can have the greatest impact. We focus our work in places our science indicates are important for biodiversity and carbon stores, and using the power of nature to help to address the threats associated with the changing climate. These 2030 goals are the foundation for our conservation work in Pennsylvania and Delaware. They ensure we focus our work on clear linkages to biodiversity and carbon benefits, and benefiting people through our place-based work, as you'll hear about when Julie talks. All of our work in Pennsylvania and Delaware contributes directly to helping the Nature Conservancy achieve these 2030 goals. And it also contributes to regional and national priorities, like our focus on the Appalachians, Chesapeake Bay, and what we call our 50-state climate strategy, which we'll hear a little bit about. Next slide. In the next segment, I'm going to talk a little bit about each of our conservation priorities in Pennsylvania and Delaware. Next slide. So the first one I'll talk about is Appalachian forests. Appalachian forests form an almost unbroken corridor of green extending from central Alabama to the Canadian Maritimes. These forests harbor some of the highest biodiversity in North America. They represent a critical migratory corridor for many species. They sequester millions of tons of carbon, produce millions of tons of oxygen annually, and they safeguard drinking water for millions of people that sit along the eastern seaboard. For this reason, the Appalachians are one of the Nature Conservancy's 4 global focus areas, and that's along with places like the Amazon, Kenya, and Kalimantan. So we're in pretty good company here. Maintaining healthy, connected, and resilient forests along the Appalachian mountain chain is essential to the premise of conserving a continental scale, climate resilient corridor, and Pennsylvania plays a key role in this. Our most important resilient connected landscapes in Pennsylvania are concentrated in 2 corridors that connect the central Appalachian region to the northern Appalachians. Places we call the Kittatinny Ridge, which sits in the eastern part of the state, extending up into the Delaware headwaters. And in the western part of the state, the Allegheny Front, which connects from West Virginia all the way up to New York into what's called the Pennsylvania Wilds, and on further into New York along the edge of the Susquehanna River Valley. These critical forest corridors are under threat from forest fragmentation and loss, incompatible timber and land management, climate change, and altered fire regimes. And in order for us to effectively conserve these corridors and keep these forests healthy so that they continue to support biodiversity and provide the range of ecosystem services I mentioned, we focus our work on protecting forests in these priority landscapes through fee acquisition and purchase of conservation easements, working with many partners across these landscapes to achieve that goal. And then improving management to ensure we maintain healthy, resilient forests. Next slide. Moving to our climate and energy priority, we're seeing the dire impacts of the climate emergency caused by high levels of carbon emissions. I think everyone here on this call is probably being inundated by the news of increasing frequency and severity of extreme storms, wildfires, flooding, and negative impacts on our infrastructure and agriculture. The best available science indicates that to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we need to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And how Pennsylvania plays a role. Pennsylvania is a major contributor to pollution that causes climate change. We are ranked 5th in the country for carbon dioxide emissions. We're also the 2nd largest net exporter of energy in the country, supplying electricity needs to many states within a multi-state interconnection grid. Although Delaware's emissions footprint is considerably smaller than Pennsylvania's, the favorable policy climate in Delaware presents opportunities for us for action on climate and clean energy that can contribute to meaningful greenhouse gas emissions in the region. In order to address this issue, our long-term goal is to see Pennsylvania emissions reductions on track to help meet net zero emissions by 2020. And there are several big challenges that we're working on. And one is to reduce emissions from energy generation and export through activities like securing full and permanent implementation of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in Pennsylvania. We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that come from industrial sources by spearheading collaborative efforts that, build a foundation for carbon capture. And to reduce Pennsylvania's transportation emissions by supporting widespread deployment of electric vehicle infrastructure and support zero emissions vehicle regulation in Pennsylvania. Next slide. The Chesapeake Bay is one of the most iconic land and waterscapes in North America. It is the nation's largest and at one time the nation's most productive estuary, supporting 3,600 species of plants and animals. And the Susquehanna River Basin, which Pennsylvania forms a large part of, comprises 43% of the Chesapeake Bay's watershed. It's the largest tributary drain to the bay. It's the single biggest source of water, providing about 50% of the bay's total freshwater flows. But it's also the single biggest source of contaminants to the bay, providing about 60% of the nitrogen load to the bay. And a lot of this is sitting on Pennsylvania's shoulders to help solve challenges. And the largest source of nutrients and sediments in the bay sitting in Pennsylvania is agriculture. In order for us to be successful in improving conditions in the bay, we need to reduce nutrients and sediments by 50% in croplands across a multi-state area that contributes to the Chesapeake Bay. This includes Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. By using soil health and advanced nutrient management practices that keep nutrients in the field, taken up by crops, and out of our waterways. And also across this multi-state region, we need to restore and enhance 235,000 acres of wetlands to help assimilate nutrients and sediments that do escape from agricultural sources, stormwater, and wastewater sources. And another challenge here, and you'll hear this kind of reoccurring theme, is climate change. It poses another challenge as increased rains are expected to result in increased nutrients reaching the bay. And many farmers are not equipped with the necessary knowledge, technology, and equipment to deal with this. And it's anticipated they will need to increase fertilizer use by 28%, which increases the amount, the potential amount flowing into our waterways in the bay. Now, with over 33,000 farms across this landscape, this requires a broad-reaching, multi-pronged approach. In large part, it will require affecting social change by engaging with farmers, agricultural service providers, corporations, and governments to change how we operate our food systems. Next slide. The Delaware Bayshore on this slide is nested within our Delaware River and Bay Conservation Priority, which includes 4 areas of work: the Delaware Bayshore and Seascape, our urban programs in Philadelphia and Wilmington, which Julie's going to describe in more detail, migratory fish, and protection of forests, critical for water quality protection in the Delaware headwaters. So this is a body of work that extends from the headwaters of the Delaware River all the way to the sea. And then the Delaware Bayshore for us is a new area of focus. So we're kind of starting building the foundation in science and policy and planning, on developing partnerships and identifying funding that will really help carry us into the future. But in the Delaware Bayshore, throughout our analysis of the challenges, sea level rise consistently rose to the top as the primary threat. Projections indicate that sea level rise will impact 97 to 99% of existing coastal systems, agricultural systems, and many at-risk communities along the Bayshore and Seascape. Our long-term goal focuses on helping nature and human communities adjust and adapt to sea level rise by allowing coastal systems to move in response to sea level rise, a concept called marsh migration, building resiliency in existing natural systems as sea level rises. So that's thinking about what will existing marshes become in the future, and how do we maintain productive ecosystems that continue to support biodiversity, and then using this natural infrastructure to help vulnerable ecosystems and human communities adapt to sea level rise. And the other one I'll just briefly touch on that is a component of this is our migratory fish initiative. Migratory fish were once very prevalent in the Delaware River system, but populations have been impacted by a history of overexploitation, climate change and habitat loss, water pollution, and poor fisheries management. Climate change is also creating unprecedented challenges for fisheries management systems. There's a lot more environmental variability and uncertainty, and these are driving shifts in productivity and distribution of fish species. Many of our fisheries management systems and our conservation systems were designed to accommodate a much more static condition, and they really often struggle to adapt to climate surprises. So our long-term outcome here is to improve fisheries management and increase the availability of quality spawning and rearing habitat. And to do this, we need to bring new and emerging technologies to improve the understanding of populations and key life history traits of migratory fish. This will help policy managers make better management decisions. And then the second piece is increasing and improving access to critical spawning and rearing habitat, which leads to increases in population size of our migratory fish in the Delaware River system. And I'll now turn it over to Julie to talk in more detail about our urban initiatives. Julie?
Thanks, Keith. I'll just do a brief introduction. I'm Julie Ulrich, for those who don't know me. I've been with TNC, I guess about 7-ish years now, helping the Conservancy at large build out the urban conservation work. So really thinking about integration of people and nature. So I work with the team nationally, and then also within the local chapter, helping to build and develop the work here in the Pennsylvania and Delaware chapter. So great to be here with you today, and please advance to the next slide. Okay, and go one more, please. Thanks. So I thought I'd start by sharing how cities connect to TNC's overall mission. You heard Lori talk and Keith talk about our goals and our strategies in the region, but I think it's important to share why cities are a focal area for us. So at TNC, we recognize that cities, towns, villages, et cetera, are key components of the broader ecological landscape, and that what happens in these places will more and more determine whether our lands and waters are healthy, which of course matters not just for nature's sake, but for our own sake. We know that by 2050, the vast majority of humanity will live in cities, towns, and other urban areas. We also know that a changing climate is creating challenges on a very complex scale, coastal and inland flooding, as well as increased heat, which is going to be exacerbated by less trees and green spaces in urbanized areas. This, of course, is going to impact livability and desirability for cities, to which I think David put it best, which is, healthy cities are the building blocks of a strong economy. So all of these trends are really critically important in thinking about the bigger, broader umbrella of why we do this work in cities. Next slide, please. So why are cities an important piece of the conservation puzzle? It's really important to note that cities have inherent value as ecosystems in and of themselves and connect to the larger terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. I'm here to officially say that yes, there's lots of nature in cities, quite a lot of it, and it really deserves to be celebrated and increased. Nature provides valuable ecosystem services to all organisms in cities, people, and other ecological organisms, and it greatly improves the health and well-being, flood reduction, air filtering, et cetera. Nature in and surrounding cities is the lifeblood of the majority of the world's population. Cities are also nodes of innovation and solutions, and one of the best ways to think about increasing the health of nature and the health of people for systemic change is to be able to do this work in cities. I've seen personally from doing this type of work for many years, how great innovative solutions get replicated many times over. And so doing work in cities like Philadelphia is helping to create systemic change on a broader scale. Many urban areas have also been historically underfunded and underrepresented in the national environmental field. So it's important to think about ways that we can look towards the next 100 years of integrating cities into environmental and conservation movements. Urban natural areas also need help adapting to climate change due to fragmented landscapes and the need to continue to provide ecosystem services and all those co-benefits to support people and urban wildlife. Next slide, please. So we know that abundant nature in urbanized areas can have a hugely positive impact, and that to expand urban greening projects and nature-based solutions in cities. Next slide, please. We know we need to fundamentally change the relationship between nature and cities so that both can thrive. So why is this notion important? Historically, there's been an either or mindset. You either care about nature or you care about people. And somehow it was thought that those two things could not coexist. We thankfully know enough now from science to recognize that these things are inextricably one and the same and linked. And so to care about nature is to care about people and vice versa. So our work in cities with TNC heartily embraces a both and approach. That you can have solutions and impacts for both nature and people. Next slide, please. Our vision is to mainstream the use of equitable nature-based solutions to improve quality of life and help cities address challenges in a changing climate. We believe that with smart planning, science-based strategies, and strong partnerships, we can make the green cities of tomorrow more resilient, healthy, and equitable. Next slide, please. So when I talk about nature-based solutions, what is that? What does that mean? It's essentially trees, wetlands, mangroves, marshes, etc. It's the natural systems that we often take for granted, but are working overtime to provide us with a host of benefits on a daily basis. And the idea of this, nature-based solutions is to really think about how to make them more functional, more connected and integrated as part of our everyday lives. This slide here gives a handful of solutions in cities. Green roofs, urban agriculture, urban forestry are actively being used around the world. And so we at TNC are working on ways to be able to sort of mainstream and scale those types of approaches. We believe that these types of solutions should not be the exception, but should be the norm. And this is why our work aims to integrate nature-based solutions at scale across our region. Next slide, please. So bringing this work closer to home, this of course is a satellite image of our region where Philadelphia and Wilmington sit. This is where our regional cities work is currently focused in the Philadelphia-Wilmington corridor. And those two cities, of course, sit within the Delaware River system, which is known as the lifeblood of the Mid-Atlantic. Next slide, please, and hit it just a couple of times. There's a few bubbles that will pop up. Perfect. Maybe one more. Yep, great. So, back on, thanks. So I want to focus on the Delaware River system just because it's a phenomenal resource that we have and we live in our region. It's a drinking water source for over 13 million people. Over 200 species of birds move along the Atlantic flyway, often stopping in our urbanized areas. We have hundreds of thousands of people using this watershed annually for recreation. We have really key migratory fish species moving in this watershed, and billions of dollars are connected to recreation, fishing, agriculture, et cetera, in this watershed. So within this entire watershed, which spans multiple states, the entire lower third of this watershed is urbanized, which is where Philadelphia and Wilmington and of course Chester and Camden, New Jersey sit. So we're really focused on this region as a way to think about solutions that can elevate impact for people and nature, given what a natural resource this watershed is. And I'll say that Philadelphia was one of the first cities that the Nature Conservancy selected to help develop an urban conservation platform, and Wilmington came in a couple years later. So this is sort of one of the the main spots that TNC initiated this work globally. Next slide, please. Our focus areas in the Philadelphia region are urban water, urban forestry. TNC also, as a science-based organization, focuses on science as a way to be able to get to actionable policy. We also work on partnerships and community engagements and transformative funding and finance. Next slide, please. I think hit this a couple of times. Yeah, there you go. Great, thanks. So I mentioned nature-based solutions, but I also mentioned equitable nature-based solutions. And I just want to touch on that concept for a moment. It's really important to note that environmental issues can be and oftentimes are environmental justice and social justice issues too. And I want to provide a couple examples of what I mean by this. So while coastal and riverine flooding, of course, can be seen as an environmental hazard that impacts property and causes quite a lot of significant damage, the photo I'm showing below it just illustrates how this also can be a public health impact as well. So while damage, of course, is created, you also have many people who are interacting with these floodwaters, which we know are contaminated, and that has caused and will continue to cause a number of different public health impacts. And then on the right side, water quality impacts, of course, we know impact those aquatic species that we've been referring to. It impacts a whole host of environmental elements. But from a social justice standpoint, we also have thousands of people who are eating fish from these rivers on a daily basis. Subsistence fishing is common in many cities, including Philadelphia. And so when we think about these issues of environment and conservation, just know that doing this type of work can also have positive benefit from a social justice and environmental justice standpoint. Next slide, please. So we started this work, it's really only a handful of years ago, and we started with a lot of deep listening sessions and moving at a slower pace just to be able to offer leverage and resources and support based on really great work that was already happening in the area. We have partnered up to convert vacant lots into urban orchards and gardens and play spaces. We've helped transform schoolyards. We have assisted Parks Department with ecological management based on practices that we have tested in central parts of the state. We have worked on mentorship programs and paid internships for many different young adults in the area. And we're currently serving on a number of different environmental advisory boards and task forces. Next slide, please. And from the learning processes that we've gone through, we are moving into a phase of multiple initiatives that reinforce each other to help build out that long-term vision of mainstreaming nature-based solutions. We are actively working on those types of solutions for climate adaptation in urban areas, working on them to improve air quality, urban heat, and connectivity through urban forestry, and to help stormwater management issues, which I'll talk a little bit more about coming up. Next slide, please. TNC is a nature-based organization, and so with that, we tend to do a lot of research and analysis. And I'm happy to say that we've done some really great work in urban areas as well. And so the work that we have been doing integrate valuations, spatial analysis, where to drive investments. And a lot of this type of research and science directly impacts the work that we do in Philadelphia region. And just to point out one, the Planting Healthy Air report was an analysis of hundreds of cities to be able to look at the ROI of tree planting, to be able to directly connect where they might be most effective to get the highest return of impact from an economic standpoint, from a health standpoint, from a livability standpoint. Next slide, please. The ways in which we work also integrate that social and environmental science. So when we're deciding where to prioritize projects, we're not only looking at where to have the highest and best ecological impact, we're also looking to see where we might have the best human impact. And so when we are integrating the science into project prioritization, we are also weaving in things such as environmental justice layers. Next slide, please. We are also layering in where there's reduced tree canopy to think about that equity aspect, knowing that less trees and green space is directly correlated with higher temperatures and heat, which directly correlates with public health impact. Next slide, please. So ways we work also are deeply embedded in partnership. All of our work is done in collaboration. All of our work is done to help advance existing great projects that are taking place across the region. Next slide, please. Some of the groups that we have worked with to date include city agencies, different nonprofits, coalitions. Sustainable Business Network has been an amazing partner. We work with the water departments, affordable housing providers. So this just gives you a brief overview of the wide variety of the partners that we work with in the region. Next slide, please. We also work in deep collaboration with the partners in the region, as well as with our own colleagues across the Conservancy. So when I mentioned helping to create urban conservation platforms within the Nature Conservancy, we as colleagues have our own internal collaborative approach to learning. We have formed an internal organization, a learning network across the cities that you see here, as well as some international ones, to be able to share lessons learned, practices and approaches, and to help replicate some of the best solutions that we are seeing in each of these areas. in which we work. Next slide, please. Another important aspect to mention is how we work using guiding values and principles. So Lori mentioned that organizationally we have larger missions and values and principles. Within an urban landscape, we think it's also important to be able to center these when we're deciding on projects and how we work with our partners. And some of those guiding values and principles include respect for people's passion for all places, recognizing that nature may not look or feel the same way for every person, and respecting that there's going to be a diversity in how people intersect with the landscape. Again, centering that integration of healthy lands and people, practicing reciprocity, meaning how to be able to work in partnership that is not just transactional, but truly has benefits for both parties or all parties involved. And again, that respecting different connections to land. Next slide, please. For us and how we do the work, we deeply believe that the process is just as important as the outcome. So, we all work for organizations and businesses that the end product is where the focus is. We also know that moving too quickly ends up perpetuating historical harms and becomes potentially less successful projects because of the lack of either representation or thought processes that have gone into developing a project. And so I just wanted to highlight in the way that we do our work, we really think about the process and how we collaborate with the partners that I showed on that slide with the logos. Next slide, please. In order to really put these beliefs into practice, we also have developed a partnership with the Center for Whole Communities to develop a framework to outline goals for urban conservation. Next slide, please. And this framework helps us think through how we do our work. Essentially, the statement of intent is to implement conservation projects that support and improve community social, physical, and ecological resilience and well-being. And so these are just checkpoints for ourselves as we move through these highly complex projects and complex landscapes to make sure that we are meeting both the goals to honor and respect community members as well as the ecological outcomes we are seeking to achieve. Next slide, please. So now that you have a better sense of how we work and the different processes and practices we embed, let's take a look at one of our projects that we're in the midst of now. Next slide, please. So what you're seeing is essentially stormwater runoff. This is what the EPA calls the fastest growing source of water pollution nationwide. Currently, there are trillions, that is trillions with a T, gallons of stormwater runoff, polluted stormwater runoff, dumping into our riverways around the country each year. And of course, with climate change, this is going to be even more extreme with increasing precipitation. In Philadelphia and about 800 other cities around the US, we have what's called combined sewer overflows. So what this means is that in wet weather, there's too much runoff from all of the impervious surface in the streets and the roofs and other hard surfaces, and that mixes with sewage from people's homes, commercial businesses, and is pushed directly into our waterways because our sewers cannot handle that capacity of stormwater runoff from all the impervious surfaces in cities. Next slide, please. Luckily, Philadelphia has a pretty stellar solution around this. And I would say not just any solution, but an unprecedented one. In 2011, the water department created what's called Green City Clean Waters. And this serves as Philadelphia's stormwater management long-term control plan. It's something that hundreds of cities are in the midst of right now with EPA. And the goal is to be able to figure out how to manage that stormwater runoff. Philadelphia serves as a regional, national, and I'd even say an international model for how to manage the polluted stormwater runoff utilizing green stormwater infrastructure at scale. This idea is to be able to use greening practices across the city to be able to almost mimic a forest in an urbanized area, or utilize kind of like a sponge metaphor to be able to soak up water where it hits the ground, using things like tree trenches and rain gardens, bioswales inside of parks. So these are the nature-based solutions that we've been talking about, and how they can be integrated across an urban landscape for the benefit of both people and nature. If this program achieves the about 10,000 green acres that they're trying to implement across the city by 2036, it will effectively remove billions of gallons of stormwater from the Delaware River annually, removing all of that polluted water that happens every single time it rains. And so it's a huge benefit for the aquatic ecosystem and Delaware River watershed. Simultaneously, it's hugely beneficial for people because it will make recreation safer. It's going to be able to add thousands of different greening projects across the city landscape. So you're seeing an unprecedented wide-scale approach of being able to meet water quality requirements from EPA at the same time of helping to transform the city landscape. Next slide, please. And so TNC's contributions to this is, one, we're a huge champion and supporter of Green City Clean Waters. It's utilizing some nature-based solutions at scale. And we currently are in the midst of developing an aggregation model. And what that means is, rather than one project here and then another project maybe 20 blocks away, we're testing models to see how you might be able to layer in multiple greening solutions into closer proximities. And so this image represents that. How do you think about layering stormwater tree pits and cisterns and green roofs and porous paving planters in one area, again, to increase the benefit to people who are living on those blocks, but also to help the water department scale that approach to make sure that their Green City Clean Waters plan is successful. We're in the midst of 3 different pilots right now in 3 different neighborhoods across 6 city blocks. One of the keys here is that TNC is working with private landowners. So we have a decades-long history of working on many successful projects with private landowners specifically. And that was one key ask the water department had for us when we started partnering with them, is how do we think about bringing private landowners into this mix? This program will not be successful unless we get private landowners involved. And so that's who we've been prioritizing based on our expertise and our history. So we're in the midst of about 10 different projects right now. Those neighborhoods have about 15,000 residents and students in very close proximity to where the projects are going. And this first pilot run is going to manage about 7 million gallons of storm water. So that's 7 million gallons of less polluted runoff going into the rivers based on this work. I'll also mention that this work is being generously supported by William Penn Foundation and other funders to help us figure out how to test this model so that it can be replicated across the city many times over. And this model is also being watched by many other cities across the US as well. So this could be something that could be replicated in mass, depending on how this goes over the next few years. Next slide, please. In order to identify where the projects were going, we partnered with the Academy for Natural Sciences at Drexel University. And this just gives an illustration of what I've referred to before, this idea of spatial analysis and science for nature and people. And so we've been taking indicators from social vulnerability standpoint, ecological vulnerability, and community capacity, and blending those together in maps. Next slide, please. To be able to help us have more of a methodical scientific approach to where projects will be sited in the future that we and partners will be working on. And so when we are doing projects, we know that they should be bringing about the best impact for both people and nature. Next slide, please. This is one of the projects that we are in the midst of right now. This is in Northeast Philadelphia, up along the Delaware River in the Holmesburg neighborhood. And we have been partnering with, next slide, please. With a faith-based institution called Holmesburg Baptist Church. It's a historic church and community that has been around for about 200 years. And adjacent to the site, we're also working with Holmesburg Christian Academy, a K-8 school, on a series of projects. Next slide, please. We have been in construction for about the last 9 months and are wrapping up projects, green stormwater infrastructure projects now with this church. We're in the midst of putting in rain gardens and tree trenches and nature playscapes for the kids who are on the school adjacent to this. And this just gives you a flavor of the complexity of these projects. This isn't, putting in plants. This is ripping up asphalt and pavements and reconfiguring the sewer systems below these project sites to be able to have the stormwater managed more naturally on site. So it's effectively cutting off that runoff from then channeling in and then moving towards the river system. Next slide, please. And this is just another aerial of the corner so you can see the scale of the work in the project. Next slide, please. This is another site, so you can see how deep the trenches end up going. But what's amazing about this is is going to hold so much water and runoff coming from not just this one property, but also from Frankfurt Avenue, the streetscape, and some adjacent impervious surface. So the amount of runoff that would have combined in the sewer system and contributed to water pollution now is going to provide this amazing catch basin of green spaces so that the community gets to enjoy it, but then it's also contributing to the overall city goals. Next slide, please. And then this is some signage that we put up while we were working on these projects. One of the other benefits of these sites that we're working on is they're highly visible. You have hundreds of people walking by them each day. You have hundreds to thousands of people who are intersecting with these landscapes and sites. So it's a great way to be able to educate around water quality benefit and nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. This is an image so that you can see when the projects are done, you can see the above ground benefit, but we oftentimes when we're walking by, you don't really get a sense of what's happening below grade around the city landscape. And so we've been partnering with Penn Praxis to be able to work on some 3D diagrams so that you can see what's happening above ground as well as how much work is happening below grade to be able to reconfigure the sewer system for that water quality management. Next slide, please. And then here's just another imagery of the different vegetation that gets brought in and how play spaces or spaces of recreation can be created while simultaneously working on green stormwater infrastructure. Next slide, please. So while we're doing that pilot in Northeast Philadelphia, we also have an upcoming one in North Philadelphia in a partnership with Esperanza. And we will be working on their headquarters with that group to be able to install green stormwater infrastructure projects to help meet the city's Green City Clean Waters goals. We will also be implementing tree canopy to meet the neighborhood's Beat the Heat campaign goals. And so this neighborhood has about 2% tree canopy compared to other neighborhoods in the city, which have about 30% tree canopy. So there's a huge disparity in terms of the amount of green space and trees. And this neighborhood feels it literally. So this neighborhood can be over 10 degrees, 15, 20 degrees hotter than other neighborhoods in the city. And so Esperanza and a number of other groups came up with this great campaign to figure out ways to beat the heat. So nature-based solutions, of course, is one of those things that can help with that from shade canopy. So we will be working with them to be able to implement green stormwater infrastructure projects as well as tree canopy over the next year. Next slide, please. And this is just an image again of how this analysis and how this works. So this is a concept plan of their headquarters. And then next slide, please. How we do the analysis to be able to figure out how you convert sites from lack of green space to layering in green space. And then how do you also layer that with the neighborhood's own identified goals? And so this shows that these types of approaches have economic and business development impact and benefit, open space benefit, and educational opportunities. And so this is the type of analysis that we do on project sites to be able to prepare and get ready for project design and implementation. Next slide, please. And we also are doing this in West Philadelphia. Friends Rehabilitation Program is an affordable housing provider, and we're working on multiple blocks of project sites that they own to help them reimagine and reconfigure their properties to be able to integrate green space. And we're doing this right now in the Belmont neighborhood. Next slide, please. I added a couple of slides in here of some of the partners with FRP and neighborhood residents we work with, because really the work is yes, it's centered in nature and environment, and it's also connected to people. And so these are just quotes from some of the folks that we work with and how they talk about this work and how it connects to, you know, careers and jobs. Next slide. And Dana here, David talks about flooding and how this type of work around green stormwater infrastructure can help minimize flooding, but then how it also can lead to job training for people. And, you know, the fact that he says that, you know, anytime you can think about flood reduction and jobs and hit all of those simultaneously is great. And I think it's true. It really illustrates that this work is sort of a win-win-win from an economic, environmental, and social standpoint. Next slide, please. And then finally, just a few final reflections around this work. You know, nature-based solutions in urbanized areas offers triple dividends. It absolutely has the economic benefit that comes along with it. You know, healthy cities are livable cities, are desirable cities to live in, and are directly connected to a strong economy. There's tremendous amount of social benefits that come along from environmental work in cities, countless co-benefits, and then of course, all of those larger ecological benefits that come along with nature-based solutions. There's huge opportunities here in Philadelphia, as well as regional and national level, to be able to be thinking about nature-based solutions, particularly as it connects to climate adaptation and climate mitigation. There is a need for more applied research and actionable science and on-the-ground projects. This idea of nature-based solutions, as I've said, it's unfortunately more of the exception and not the norm. So how do we work and partner together to think about making these projects more mainstream? And how do we start to connect nature-based solutions to climate adaptation? It'll be really important in the years to come. And then the need for a stronger equity lens, you know, asking when we're doing projects in cities at any scale, really who benefits from these projects? Are they going into areas that really could need it the most from a vulnerability standpoint? And how do we think about equity when it comes to planning and development and design? So those are a few thoughts to offer, but I welcome any conversation and questions you might have. And I'll stop there. I think that's it. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Okay. So that's the last slide. I should. Okay. So we can, it's terrific to hear from all of you. We can open it up to questions. I'm just closing my screen here. Does anybody have questions? You can just unmute or post in the chat.
Hi, it's Ed. I just had a question about what are the costs associated in terms of the project you mentioned where you were digging up a lot of the sidewalk and the sewer. Just curious the cost of that project and maybe the added cost to construction people or developers when they're doing a building. Probably is a lot less to do it from the beginning, and just wondering what that cost would be. Thanks.
Yeah, sure, Ed, thanks. Yes, it's true. There, Yes, it's ideal if we are redeveloping and building, absolutely thinking about how to maximize environmental design from the beginning is always cost effective. There are many opportunities though to do retrofits, and that is what we are focusing on. We're focusing on retrofits with private landowners across the city. The cost of that project that you saw was about in the $450,000 range, which is about average, I would say, for a parcel of that size. The Philadelphia Water Department has grants that they offer for projects like that, so that that cost isn't falling on just the landowners to be able to cover the bill. There's assistance that comes from the city. You can apply for these types of grant projects and get funding, which we did, and we were awarded a couple grants from the city to be able to help cover the design and construction cost of these projects. And then we also fundraise to be able to add in additional amenities to reach those co-benefits that we were mentioning for people. So that's the price range. I also say that if you were doing new design in the city, the stormwater regulations do require any new parcel to be managing stormwater on site. So that is helping to increase the goals of the Green City Clean Waters Plan.
Thanks a lot. It was a great presentation too. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hey, Julie, the work you're doing and your team is doing is very impressive. I'm curious, when you're working with private landowners, or even when you're working with the Holmesburg Baptist Church, how does that partnership develop? Are they approaching you? Are you approaching them? Does somebody help connect the two of you? Like, exactly how does that happen?
Such a great question. I love this. You know, with the maps that I showed in terms of how we do that analysis, we know which target areas of the city that we want to prioritize because we've done that ecological analysis and social analysis. So oftentimes we will hone in on sort of a hot spot, an area that's really popping on that spatial analysis, and we'll say, okay, who are the landowners within this region? And we will then start to prioritize private landowners who maybe could most benefit from these types of projects, and we start to strike up conversation. So we have a list of, you know, maybe here's a dozen groups that we would love to reach out to, and that's how we connected with Esperanza. It's how we connected really with most of the landowner partners. Sometimes we do get calls though. Sometimes we do have folks that say, you know, here's a property or a parcel you might want to take a look at. Let us know what you think. So you know, maybe with a group like this, it'd be helpful once we identify our priority areas for the next year or two to be able to share that, to say if anybody has connections with landowner partners in that area, we would love to be able to have a conversation to be able to see if that could be a good partnership for green stormwater infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And if I could just follow up with one other question, which I think would be just, it has to be difficult to prioritize your work and your dollars. Do you think it slants more towards adaptation, or, you know, like how do you prioritize which piece of the pie in terms of fighting climate change? Because there's so many, so many issues.
Yeah, I can take that at multiple levels of prioritization. You know, from a climate change perspective, maybe I can kick that to Keith around kind of the climate change around the state and the region, and then I can speak to maybe more of a more local context. But Keith, if you want to field the question around how we prioritize what we're doing on climate change around the region, that would be great.
When we went through our strategic planning effort, we took a look at what the biggest contributors of emissions were across the state. And that was what I kind of highlighted. You know, the energy generation is a big one. Interestingly enough, industrial emissions are the #1 source in Pennsylvania. So that rose to the top, and then kind of EV. There were a few other sources that we did evaluate, you know, things like orphan wells that do contribute methane and other sources. But we started with that. And then by taking a look at that, we looked at what are the opportunities to have influence and make a difference in the space. And then, of course, what can the Nature Conservancy bring to the table that actually, makes a change there? So all those kind of feed in, but it starts with identification of what the biggest issues are.
Yeah, and I can add to that. It's similar for us in an urban context. What are the biggest issues and challenges? Who might already be working on them, where we can be additive versus duplicating or replicating, or where might there be gaps that TNC has skill sets and expertise that maybe isn't necessarily present already. So those are questions that come into play. I'll also add that when it comes to climate adaptation, we know that everybody experiences climate impacts. It's not discriminating in terms of who is facing those. However, we do know that certain people feel them more acutely and more intensely, and not just people, but whole neighborhoods across Philadelphia as well as other cities. And so when we are choosing where to invest time and energy, we just think it's best that we can do that in a way that is getting that environmental impact and, to the best that we can, getting that social impact at the same time. If you can spend $1 to be able to have the environmental impact, why not do it where you can also have social impact at the same time? So we really look for those intersections and multiple benefits to help us prioritize our projects, and are looking for areas to do our work that have been historically underrepresented and underfunded, because there's a direct correlation with those neighborhoods and populations and who is facing the brunt of climate change. Those are the frontline communities. They're at the front of facing climate change. So that's where we've been targeting our work at to date.
I have a couple questions. I don't know if this is for Lori, Keith, or Julie. Do you guys work with City Council, Philadelphia City Council? And if so, in what kind of partnership do you, and who are the folks in City Council that are on the are our green champions?
Because I jump in for that one. So to date, we aren't actively working with City Council. We have been doing our work with and through and by other partners to date. So really sort of taking our cues from all of the partners in the region, and city agencies have been who we've been partnering with the most. But that is on our minds in the next couple of years, is what might that strategy be? How might partnerships with City Council directly help advance this work at large or in certain neighborhoods? So it's a very timely question, David, and something that's front and center in our minds about what we will be doing coming up in the next year or two.
I'd like to just begin by saying this has been really educational and insightful and inspiring. It's really great to see the work that you're all doing. And my question is kind of an associative question about environmental monitoring. I mean, that the work that you're doing is planning at Esperanza, and other areas, to be able to measure the heat island improvement from increasing the tree canopy, or being able to measure stormwater runoff, being able to get data to kind of document the positive results of both stormwater management and things like that. Those of us who are active with SBN's green stormwater infrastructure are really looking at ways that we're trying to get the data to affirm the efficacy of these kinds of installations. So both for air and water, soil quality and other kinds, are there ideas that are percolating up about how to do that kind of integration into the capital budgets for actually building out the sites? So Any notes on that? I'd be really interested in.
Thanks, Greg. Yes, great question. I'm happy to say yes. Yes, as a science-based organization, monitoring is a frequent conversation that we have. And we had actually intended to do that on the Holmesburg site, but the pandemic derailed, and unfortunately, yeah, put a damper on that site. But it's something that we can still look ahead to the Esperanza site, I think would be ideal. You know, especially considering that it's not just the tree canopy from a heat perspective. We also know that there's huge air quality disparities, and that those things are completely linked. You know, air quality, heat, lack of green space, and lack of trees. So yes, it's really important to figure out how to monitor, not just for our own information, but because that type of data can help drive policy. That type of data can help drive investment. Oftentimes we find that while data exists, it's not necessarily in the language that certain decision makers need. And so we really try to pair up with city agencies and key decision makers to get data in their hands that resonates with them. So advocacy data, hugely important and beneficial, but may not speak to, say, the CFO of a water utility, may not speak to somebody who is determining where investment dollars are going to go from an infrastructure standpoint when new money comes down the line. And so we think it's really critical to figure out how to pair up to do the monitoring, but to get to the data that will resonate with decision makers. And a way to do that is to make sure that they're at the table and part of those conversations, helping to design what those monitoring plans are so that it speaks to a whole host of audiences. We're doing that work right now from a co-benefit standpoint. We were hearing from a lot of different water utilities, staff from Philadelphia Water Departments, but many other water utilities, that while data is out there that talks about the co-benefits of green stormwater infrastructure, it wasn't necessarily in the format that was needed. And so we're in the midst of doing research right now with a host of water utilities to figure out what kind of shape that takes. So I can imagine a really similar process for the Esperanza project. And that will kick off not until next year, but definitely happy to keep you posted on what the monitoring conversations shape up to be. But I'm really glad you asked that. Thank you. I appreciate it.
I might add quickly to that, you know, on a larger scale outside of the urban, we do try to incorporate it into all of our work. You know, for example, I was talking about the Delaware headwaters and protection of headwater resources. We frequently work with partners that are better suited to, you know, actually do that monitoring on the ground. So there's monitoring activities up there. You know, we pursue as much as we can. For example, what is the impact of forests on carbon sequestration? We're doing a lot of that through remote sensing. So we engage with a lot of partners that have that expertise and can look at remote sensing across broad swaths of the landscape. And then, you know, in the Chesapeake Bay, looking at how activities that we're undertaking and how certain practices are benefiting water quality. So there are always gaps, but it is certainly something that's front and center for us.
Julie, could you talk about the young people that you brought into your efforts, the volunteers, the mentees, how you go about that, how many there are, how's that worked out, that type of thing? Can you talk about that, please?
Sure, I can add to that. So, well, there's multiple tiers of how we do this. First off, I'll start with the volunteers. We have an amazing volunteer manager, Molly, who organizes these great events. If there are university students, if there are other neighborhood organizations, if there are businesses who want to have their employees come out, she helps us organize larger scale cleanup days or some sort of installation days. And so we have done a number of those in the city that have brought out, I would say 30 to 50 people at a time. And we've done those on sites like In Point Breeze neighborhood, we partnered up with the Nationality Service Center, which is one of the largest national organizations for bringing refugees in and resettling them in Philadelphia. And so they have a massive, almost a block scale garden plot for micro entrepreneurs. And so we partnered with the Nationality Service Center, neighbors from that community, and then brought in a number of different university students, and also Lowe's, who we have a partnership with, a national partnership with Lowe's staff from the local Lowe's store in South Philadelphia to come in and have some shared work days to help build out that program. It's called the Growing Together Garden. It's an amazing, amazing site in the city. So that's one example. And there are a number of different ways that we can think creatively around volunteer experiences for people of all ages. Another layer is we formerly had a program, a LEAF program, which was about leadership for environmental action and for the future. And so it was bringing in high school students for paid month-long internships to be able to shadow and work with different TNC staff over the summer to gain experiences. And a number of those students went on to become Globe Fellows, which TNC had also hosted. And then a number of them did end up working for TNC or went off to other environmental organizations. So those types of programs arise when there's a need. We've also partnered with the U.S. Forest Service to be able to do street tree monitoring in Philadelphia, and worked on doing some of that monitoring and data collection. To Craig's point, street trees were put in, but you need to monitor them every certain number of years to make sure that they're still alive, to look at their growth habit and pattern. We brought in a number of high school students and college students to be able to assist with that monitoring, did training, offered them paid internships. Through the Alliance for Watershed Education, of which the Nature Conservancy is part of. It's 23 different environmental education centers across 4 states in the Delaware River watershed. We also bring in a fellow each summer. So there's a number of different tiers of ways that we integrate youth and integrate students at all ages up to college level to be able to integrate their ideas and their thinking, and then offer training in return. So yeah, it's quite a wide variety. And then I'll say lastly on that point, through all of our project sites across the city, there are countless opportunities to think about ways to get students and youth involved, from arts to education to helping to install these types of projects. So that will continue to be a feature as we move into our next series of projects in 2022.
Great.
Thanks.
Very cool.
Alex, did you have a question? Or if you're still there.
I didn't have a question, but I wanted to thank the Nature Conservancy for all the work that you guys do. It's been so great to see all the great projects that are coming in. I'm just really excited to know more and to keep an eye on things, and definitely want to stay informed on those. Also, the work that the Academy of Natural Sciences is doing with their sewage shed prioritization is really excellent, and knowing that you guys are so involved with it is really exciting.
Thanks, Alex. Great to see you.
Absolutely.
Does anybody have another question? We have time for one more if you'd like. Well,
I'll throw one
Lori.
more in then. I'll throw one more in.
You throw one more, okay.
Okay, so this is also I guess a toss-up question for either Laurie, Keith, or Julie. We at Center City CCPA, we have signature series. We have lunch with city leaders. We have meet the developers. We also have women changing the city. Maybe we need to meet the landowners, Ben. But out of those city leaders, women changing the city, meet the developers, who are the green champions of those groups? Who are the folks that come to your mind as These folks really get it.
So you're looking for companies,
People or
corporate
companies.
owners.
Yeah.
So
I can jump in, somebody that immediately comes to mind is a councilwoman in the 3rd district, Jamie Gauthier. She's doing really amazing work in West Philadelphia and really committed to the notion of, people in cities thriving in all kinds of communities, and much of her district is, I would consider underrepresented. So that's a name that immediately comes to mind. Julie, I don't know if you have others, partners that you're working with.
Catherine Gilmore Richardson also has been hosting, and Alex here, I guess, has been hosting a series of environmental roundtables, trying to really better understand what environmental needs there are in the city. And I think that that's a huge benefit moving forward. Other champions, I think to really be able to make impact in Philadelphia, we need to move beyond maybe say the usual suspects. I think we need to have those usual suspects in the room, but figuring out how do you expand that ecosystem of people who, they may not consider themselves pro-environment or sustainability champions, but there are different ways to seek alignment. There are different ways to be able to have conversations that, if you care about economy and business, then, this is why water makes sense for you to be a champion for this. And so I get excited when I think about who are the people who we haven't had in these conversations, and who are the people that we can start to bring into that fold and have dialogue around that alignment, because we do need a larger group of people. There's amazing work happening in the city from all sectors, but I do think we need to expand the table or rebuild the table in terms of who is around it. And the idea of partnering on something like that, I think, could be really exciting. And David, I'd welcome a follow-up conversation if you'd be up for it, to really brainstorm around that. While I can list businesses who have done some really interesting development work, or thinking about, LEED certification, or the push for more parks and trail systems, all of those things are great. But who are we missing? And how can we better support those who are already doing the work and have been doing it for a long time would be the ideal. And this is a great group of folks to kind of brainstorm around that topic with.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, David. All right. Sounds like there's thank yous all around. And yes, I think for our future discussions and also planning, that'd be great for some of us to follow up with some of these ideas. But I do want to thank Lori, Keith, and Julie for taking the time to prepare the presentation and join us today to answer the questions, and all of you for joining us. It's been terrific. We're going to plan some more events for the coming year. So hopefully you can all participate in those, or feel free to send us ideas and get in touch if you want to participate.